You grew up in Silicon Valley. What was your understanding of that place at that time?
So I grew up in the 80s in Silicon Valley, and my parents were really early in tech. But it wasn't a money thing at that time. It was really a hobbyist kind of thing. You were in it because you really believed. And so I grew up very idealistic about tech, right? Like my parents were in it because it was like exciting and it was going to open up new scientific areas. You know, my dad's a mathematician, my mom's a chemist, so they were both using it in ways that kind of like supercharged their existing work. And so I started programming in 5th grade. I studied math and computer science in college. I worked at my summers in Hewlett-Packard, and I really thought tech was sort of an empowering and a liberating force.
And why didn't you stay in tech?
You know, I didn't stay in tech because I fell in love with journalism, honestly. In college, I got a job on the campus newspaper because I knew how to use the layout software. And so I really just started it as a job. Like I think it paid, I feel like I got made like $5 an hour or something.
Okay.
And but after a little bit of time in the newsroom, I thought, wow, these guys seem like they're having a lot of fun who are writing the stories. So I started reporting, and then eventually I became editor-in-chief. And when I graduated, I actually could have gone back to Hewlett-Packard, but I was like, I'll just have some fun and do journalism for a little while, and then I'll go back to tech. And then, of course, I didn't ever go back.
So then you started working, covering tech. What was the relationship between tech and journalism in the 90s? Like, where were you? How were you covering that? And what was that dynamic like at that time?
Yes, I started at the San Francisco Chronicle in 96. I'm sorry. I think I started in 96. Yes, I started at the San Francisco Chronicle in 1996. And so Netscape had just gone public. And they hired me in part because they didn't really have people who understood tech. In the newsroom at that time, actually, there were not any personal computers. It was all sort of dumb terminals connected to a mainframe. I was actually unique in that I had a computer at home. So at the very least—
It's amazing that just in 96 that was the case.
Isn't that amazing? Remarkable. And so like Netscape, I remember they were so arrogant. They were flying so high. So they insisted that they would only send press releases by email, but no one in our newsroom could get an email. And we wanted them to send press releases by fax because that's how all the press releases arrived. And like there were, copy aides who went to the fax machine and distributed all the press releases. Yeah. And so I would have to go home and check my home machine
to get your Netscape press release to then translate it to the newspaper, to the newsroom.
Yeah. So the relationship was interesting because at that point, newspapers were still really a big gateway for getting your news out there. I remember I wrote a feature called Website of the Week. And every week I'd pick a different website to write about. And websites were really excited about that because nobody knew how to find anything, Searching and like finding things on the web was still hard. And so all the tech companies would come and try to lobby the reporters to like write about them. And I feel like that actually still informs a little bit of the culture of tech reporting, that tech reporters have come from a field where they're used to this idea that they are kind of quasi-reviewers, that they assess the software, tell the audience whether to use it or not. And I think that it took a long time for tech journalism to evolve into being a little bit more critically minded. It always felt to me like it was like it had this reviewer sensibility.
So what happened when social media bumped into that relationship? So I guess you were then beyond the Chronicle, you were at the Wall Street Journal by then. And what was that dynamic and how were you introduced to that relationship between the potential of social media and the journalism you were doing?
I really got deep into social media when I started writing about MySpace. So it was, it was weird. I was hired by the Wall Street Journal at the height of the dot-com bubble in 2000. They literally said, we just cover the internet. And I said, is there anything particular about the internet you want me to cover? And they were like, no, just everything. Because at that point, they had so many ads from dot-com companies that were going public that they just needed to fill their pages. And so when News Corp bought MySpace, I remember saying to my editors, like, look, this is actually really big, this social media thing. We should cover it really intensely. And they were like, I feel like the main story for News Corp is really their satellite TV business, and that's like what you should focus on. So
Not the internet.
Not the internet. So I went out and took a book leave and wrote a book about MySpace. And I think diving in and really in depth on one of the first social media companies made me realize how important this technology was going to be.
What was the value proposition that social media, I mean, MySpace wasn't really sort of the catalyst to journalists going online and it was really Facebook,
it was
right?
Facebook.
So what was the value, what happened when Facebook came into the newsroom and what was that dialogue like and what were they offering to you as a journalist, to the institution of journalism? What was the promise?
Well, I still remember, when my editors kind of finally cottoned on to social media and got really excited about Facebook. And it went from nothing, 0 to 60, basically. Like they were basically totally ignoring it and then suddenly wanted all in. And one of the things I had realized while covering MySpace was that this wasn't free, that there was this whole privacy cost to participating in social media, that they were taking your data and essentially monetizing it. And I was concerned that the newsrooms I was in, Wall Street Journal, then ProPublica, were not really calculating effectively the costs that they were giving up. So by putting the Facebook buttons on their pages, they were basically allowing Facebook to track their users. And then
that was not widely known, though. I mean, I remember being in conversations where people were debating the value of an email-based login system versus a Facebook login. And it just seemed universally better to use this Facebook one because it connected you into something bigger.
I mean, yes, except for the fact that I would like to say that when I came back from my book leave on MySpace and this whole thing was hitting, which was in 2009, I launched a 3-year-long series on privacy about this exact issue.
Yes.
Which I would have thought.
Which did have a pretty big impact. However, publishers kept doing this over and over and over again.
But it didn't have an impact on my actual organization.
Right.
Wall Street Journal, they were happy to publish them, but it didn't change the calculation. And I think what happened is that newsrooms really gave away access to their lucrative audiences. To be fair, I'm not sure they could have stopped it, right? Because the reality is the way the Wall Street Journal made money was they were the gateway. If you wanted a middle-aged, BMW driving, golfing, mid-tier executive, the Wall Street Journal was the place, right? And that's the reason that their full-page ads were hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that audience was the only way you could get them was there. When we started allowing what is called surveillance advertising or whatever you want to call it, but the ability to track people across websites, you could find those people online. You could build a dossier about somebody who was a BMW loving, golfing, mid-level executive. And so I don't know if the Journal could have prevented that, but certainly they didn't stop it. They allowed that tracking to happen on their site so that literally you could just find a Wall Street Journal audience member somewhere else on the internet cheaper, right? And essentially what's happened in the past 20 years is a transfer of all of the advertising dollars, literally most of the advertising dollars have left media and gone into these tech companies.
What started to go wrong in that relationship between publishers and platforms?
Well, I think the publishers entered into those relationships thinking that they had more power than they had.
Because they were the Wall Street Journal.
They were the Wall Street Journal. They were these were entities that had real monopolies on their audiences, right? So they were very much used to having a lot of market power. And I don't think they saw the change coming the way that I think I saw it because I sort of had more experience with this industry and I understood more in depth what this tracking of advertising was going to mean for their audience, which was they were going to be able to find your entire audience somewhere else online cheaper.
So that core value proposition of delivering matching audiences to someone who wants to reach audiences was the thing that was...
The matching was gone. Now the matching is done by an ad exchange.
I'm very curious what it was like in the Journal. So you're in this pinnacle of traditional journalism, writing about a new industry, frustrated that this journalism's going down this potential path that you see as potentially problematic here. How did that feel to be inside the belly of the beast talking about something that could threaten it ultimately, this thing you cared about?
Well, I have to say, I have basically spent my whole life being kind of a Cassandra. So unfortunately, this is a fairly familiar feeling to me where I'm yelling about something and everyone's...
Why aren't you listening to me?
And everyone's like, what are you talking about? And then 10 years later, they're like, oh, I think I should have listened to you.
Privacy, right. So, okay, so we have this 10-year arc of this relationship between social media and journalism. During that time, social media explodes, journalism starts to decline. Okay. I was going to say a decline. Let's go full collapse.
I think global revenues have fallen by more than, like, it's gone from 20 billion to 10 billion. And
yeah, it could be steeper than that.
Yeah. Actually, I think that might be US, right? So anyways, the numbers are insane, right? Like we're on a steep decline.
Right. And the trajectory of social media platforms was to become the biggest companies in human history over this same period.
Correct.
Right? What does that period and that transition tell us about where we are now?
I mean, to be honest, what I feel like I've learned is that it was a very brief period of time where journalism could succeed entirely as for-profit businesses in a capitalistic market economy. Ultimately, journalism is a public good. It is really important for a democracy. It's important for informed citizens. It is very hard to get people to pay for public goods, right? I don't pay directly for garbage pickup, roads, ambulances. I pay for them through my taxes, and it wouldn't be a livable city without any of those things, and yet it's very hard to get people to, like, pay directly for those things. And to me, journalism is like that. You don't necessarily always want to read journalism, right? Like, the problem is you want somebody holding city council accountable. You want them writing all those stories and going to all those meetings. But do you want to read them?
No. I mean, nobody does.
Really. No, nobody does.
Maybe the subject of them needs to read them.
And the only reason that it existed before is because they were part of a bundle that had crosswords and comics and a health columnist and gadget reviews and feature stories and style sections and fashion. It was part of a package that had a lot of entertainment in it. And so I think that's why it was able to succeed. And once that became unbundled, which actually was probably inevitable with the internet, even if we didn't have surveillance advertising, it's just really hard to support some of the most standalone essential pieces of journalism.
So that market-driven mentality and model and reliance could have really just been the sort of writing on the wall from an early stage to journalism as we transitioned into a different economy.
It feels like, in retrospect, it was a historical anomaly because, honestly, prior to the middle of the 19th century, journalism was kind of a patron-based business with a local millionaire in each city supporting their own paper.
Are we coming back to that patron model, do you think, now? Is that where
we are
we're
fully
headed?
back in the patron model, I think. I mean,
so what are some examples of that?
Well, I mean, a classic example of it is Jeff Bezos saving the Washington Post. I mean, Murdoch buying the Wall Street Journal, same thing, right? It wasn't really a viable business, and so he's a patron.
So looking at the journalism landscape now, this kind of remarkable thing is happening where a new round of technology and technology companies, in terms of generative AI models, is reaching back into journalism with many of the same promises, financial relationships, offers to subsidy and support to publishers, as was the case 15 years ago. How do you look at that relationship now between journalism organizations and AI companies?
Well, I would say it's a much more toxic relationship this time around.
Worse.
Absolutely. Because what's happening right now is the AI companies are coming to news outlets and saying, I already stole all your stuff. Do you want me to pay you to make this theft legal? Literally, that's the argument.
So these contracts are sort of like indemnifying them from previous copyright violations or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is not a transaction so much as it is a shakedown. I think this is kind of like when, somebody comes to your store and says, "Nice store you have here. It'd be a pity
if you lost it."
Right? I mean, it just doesn't feel like this is a market transaction.
So News Corp, The Atlantic signed a deal.
Reuters, AP. Yep.
What is leading these companies to take that deal?
Because what are you going to do? You're already on this steep slide. You're desperate, right? You are losing revenue every year, and they already took your stuff. And it's not at all clear that you're going to be able to get it back, right? I think I'm really proud of the New York Times for taking a brave move to sue OpenAI.
Okay, so explain that decision-making and what they did.
Well, I wasn't privy to their decision-making, but I would say that it was clear to me that somebody needed to make a challenge to this fair use argument. So the companies who stole all this information.
How did they steal it?
So the way that they stole, well, I actually don't know because a lot of it's behind the paywall, but somehow they got a hold of the entire corpuses, it seems, of these different news outlets.
How do we know they had that?
Well, I don't know that we know that they have the entire corpus, but I think we've learned a lot through the New York Times lawsuit about what they think that they have. Mm. And it looks like it's quite a bit of it. They probably don't have the stuff that's on microfiche, but anything that you could get from the internet, from the website. So perhaps they logged in as a user and scraped everything. Yeah. So most likely they scraped everything off of the website that you could get. And their argument is that they used it to train their models, but that's fair use because fair use allows you to basically use some small portion of the information to inform new content that you can argue is not the same. That's not plagiarism. It's not like you just cut and paste it. Yeah. And I think that's an argument that to me needs to be tested in court because the reality is that if you train your model on a news article about something and then you spit out that same information, but the sentences are just slightly rewritten, which is a lot of times what generative AI does, I don't know. To me, I'm a writer, so obviously I'm biased, but I think that looks like theft, right? So I think it's important that we have some court rulings on that. And for a while there, until the New York Times suit, I was really surprised that no one had stepped forward because it's expensive, right? And the Times has, I think, disclosed they've already spent about $1 million. They'll probably spend more. So you need someone with some financial heft to bring that case.
So the Times takes one route. Other publishers have entered into these deals. So what did you think when you started seeing these emerge again, these similar kinds of deals as previous generation?
Honestly, it just felt sad because you'll get a one-time payout. And if you think about the entire archive of a news service like the AP that's been running for more than 100 years, right? I just feel sad. What it means to me is that if you're an AP reporter, in some sort of meaningful way, you work for AI. You're basically building...
You're an AI model trainer.
Yeah, you're just you're creating facts to be fed into the machine and they are getting the profit from it, right? Those are for-profit all the AI companies are for-profit companies that are aiming to charge a lot of money eventually for their AI outputs. And so essentially it feels to me like my profession, journalist, has just become similar to the content moderation workers in Kenya. We're just these farmers who are in content farms just creating information for AI. And that is a really, really sad outcome.
Why do AI companies, why do they need journalism? So is it that they are running out of data that has been scraped and they need more high quality, truthful, fact-based information to make their models better? Or is it just they don't want to be sued and this is a way of sort of making journalism go away a little bit?
I think it's about making the models better because there's a understanding, which I would like to say I'm not sure is true. But the understanding in the AI field, the conventional wisdom is that more data makes better models. And so they are incredibly data hungry.
And are fighting for it, right?
They're fighting for data. They're scraping it from everywhere they can possibly find. They've talked about how they might have to make synthetic data to make their models better. So there's this incredible data race going on. And journalism is high-quality information, most of it. It's fact-checked. It's higher quality information than just the random other stuff you're going to scrape from the internet.
So AI is doing something else, which is it's changing the character of the information ecosystem as well in which journalism is situated. How do you think about how AI and generative content is changing just the entirety of the digital ecosystem and the quality of information and the type of information that we're immersed in?
I think one of the things that upsets me the most about AI is this myth that there's one true answer, that the AI will spit out the answer. The reality is the world is complicated, and for almost any question, no matter how innocuous, there are multiple ways to look at it. There's nuances, there's exceptions. And so that's what is so beautiful about a Google search result is that there'll be dozens and dozens of links. And even by scanning them, you kind of get a sense of the landscape of the truth. And the reality is that is what the truth is. It's a landscape filled with objects, some of them contradictory. And so the idea that there's just one answer is a fiction and a dangerous fiction.
What explains Google then doing what they're doing, which is undermining that core? I mean, they started doing it with just putting so many ads in your search results anyway, but they've taken this step now where they're kind of saying there's one answer to anything you might want to ask us, and we're going to give it to you.
Yeah, and half the time it's wrong, it seems.
It certainly seems like it. I mean, what a risky gamble to your core value proposition.
I think that this will be taught in business schools. You had a product that was literally synonymous with the truth, right? People use Google it as an example of find the right answer,
the answer to your
find
question.
The answer. Yeah. And then you decided to put an incredibly unreliable, untruthful answer on top of that existing answer. I truly believe it will be one of the classic cases of a company destroying their brand.
Is this playing on a desire for simplistic answers? Do we no longer want to even look at the first page of a Google search result? We'd rather be told the answer.
I think there's a sci-fi version of this that people fall in love with, where you walk around and talk to a robot or something, and it just tells you things. It's Hal, it's her, whatever version of that you want to buy into. And so I feel like that there is definitely a romantic version of that. But I think when you look at what people actually do and how they behave, they still go to Google search results. Like Alexa and Siri are not as popular as it would have seemed like they would be when they first came out, right? And
so they weren't very good.
Right. But this one isn't very good either.
You make a strong point. It's more convincing, though.
Yeah.
It convinces you to think it's good.
It does have the illusion of truth around it.
Yeah. The illusion of truth. I mean, my goodness, if there's something journalism needs to step into, it's that conversation, right?
Debunking the illusion of truth.
Sure. And standing up in some way and speaking for and about truth.
Yes. This is what I'm doing with my new startup.
So tell me about that.
So I've started a new journalism studio called Proof, and it literally asks the question, how did you prove that thing that you're telling me, right? And so every story has an ingredients label of what was our hypothesis? What is our sample size? Even if it's literally 3 anecdotes, I want to be really honest with the audience. What is the sample size? What do we think we found out? And what are the limitations? The most important thing are limitations. There are always limitations, right? And so I think this is my bid to sort of fight against AI, to embed all that in the news itself so that you cannot escape how this news was produced. That the manufacture of it is actually part of the story.
So how does that work then,
Well,
essentially?
I mean, our first investigation was of AI. We actually looked at how AI models respond to voter inquiries. And we brought in election officials from across the U.S. to rate the answers, because a lot of times the answers actually looked pretty plausible to me as a non-election expert. But the officials were like, oh my gosh, these are completely wrong, misleading, et cetera. And so we showed our methodology, we released our data, we had an ingredients label, and we had experts involved in the testing. And so we were just incredibly transparent about the entire process. So it wasn't just a hot take of like, AI is bad. It was like, here's a huge sample of 150 queries, and they were rated by experts, and more than half of them were incorrect. And so I want people to be able to see that whole process and understand it and make their own conclusions.
One of the ambitions or promises, I guess, of putting journalism onto social media was that more truthful or quality information into this ecosystem would help its character, right? That would help would lift the overall quality of the social media ecosystem. And I'm not totally sure that has proven out to be the case. The incentives of that ecosystem seem so strong towards other kinds of content that in some ways journalism has just been drowned out. Could that be the case with AI too? That there's just going to be so much generated content that no matter how many good facts we create or put into it from journalism, that we're sort of against that headwinds again?
I mean, this is certainly what Meta executives will tell you, right? They'll say the audience doesn't want these facts. They just want like to share cooking recipes and like talk about sports and blah, blah, blah. And that's their claim.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's true. The evidence is pretty clear that people do really enjoy news when there's a big moment, the Trump trial or some sort of insane weather event, whatever. People go to social media to see the breaking headlines, to get first-person recounts from people who are on the ground. It is a very compelling way to get news. It reminds me of when I was a young reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and I had the news wires up on my computer running all day, and I could sort of see, the breaking news, and there would be like earthquake, okay, how many dead, okay, that number is revised, and you'd see it rolling. And that was a privilege that only I had at that time as a journalist, having access to the news wires. But now I feel the whole world has access to the news wires. And you don't want it every day maybe, but when you want it, you really want it because you need to know the information.
And do you think people still care about facts the same way that journalism always hoped and thought they did? I mean, people are presented with all sorts of facts about the election being stolen, and yet they still believe what they believe. A lot of people do.
Yeah, people say this all the time to me, like, oh, it doesn't matter. Nobody cares about facts. They just want to believe what they want to believe. I'm not willing to buy into that. That feels to me like the path of despair. Of course, you can see the world through that lens, and you can definitely find evidence for that hypothesis. But I truly believe that bringing new facts to light can change the world. For instance, everybody used to smoke. Then we learned that it kills you. A lot fewer people smoke. Okay, some people still smoke. Cool. They overlook the little picture of a dying person or the rotting lungs on their cigarettes and on the pack.
They choose to do so.
They choose to do so. And I'm not going to say we should force them to not smoke. But I think facts did make a difference. They don't solve everything. But I truly believe, that's why I do what I do. That's why I'm a journalist. I truly believe facts really matter. And I think we need to keep bringing them to light, especially facts that challenge power, because power does not want challenge. And so they are never going to bring those facts to light, right? So facts that are convenient to power will have a very happy life. They will be promoted. They will circulate. But journalist's job is to promote facts that nobody wants written, right? This is the George Orwell quote, right? Journalism is what somebody doesn't want published. Everything else is public relations.
And what do you think are those big stories around AI that need to be told? What's the power there that needs to be made public and transparent, and the stories that they don't want to be told about themselves?
Well, I think that for a long time, the AI companies actually were getting away with this kind of interesting story. The story they were selling was the only thing you need to worry about is AI being too good, so good that it decides to kill humans, right? And that was their big claim. And it was actually pretty clever marketing because it made it seem really kind of sexy.
And so powerful. Like, look how powerful this thing we're building is. Yeah.
So dangerous. Like, don't you want to try it? It's kind of like...
It may blow up the world.
Yes, exactly. It was like getting on a roller coaster or something, right? And they really convinced people to sort of ignore the reality, which was the thing barely works. It gets the answers wrong half the time, right? Honestly, Google putting its AI at the top of search results has woken up the entire world who might not have ever tried ChatGPT to the fact that Google is now recommending that people should eat rocks and put glue on their pizza, right? These are absurd things.
These were things that they provided in their Gemini search
this
result,
was
right?
Search results that appeared in their AI, generated by AI.
Yeah.
And so they got away. They got about a good year and a half of like not taking our eye off the existing product and focusing toward this mythical future
But where
product.
was journalism there? I mean, haven't we built this idea that journalism could take on tech power? And like, that's why Silicon Valley's been rebelling against journalism, is because you were doing that. Like, you personally were holding you to account as a node of power in society.
Yeah.
And then this new big thing comes up. And like, why didn't journalism do journalism on OpenAI?
I mean, some people did. I did. Some people did. And there aren't enough of us and we're not funded. And doing kind of, the thing is, this is sort of what I believe journalism needs to do more of, is more systematic studies and less anecdotal one-offs. So there were a lot of one-offs, like, oh, Kevin was like trying to break up my marriage. But that's a one anecdote. And so it's easy for the companies to dismiss. And
correct it the second it happens, right? Like, we fixed that problem.
Yes.
Let's iterate.
So that's why I have built my whole career about basically trying to build bigger sample sizes. And people accuse me of like, oh, you're just trying to be an academic, you're trying to be a researcher. And I'm like, I'm not.
Shameful accusation,
I know.
I gotta say. It's just
terrible.
To wear that mark would just be embarrassing.
But the thing is, I can move much faster than academia. And I think journalism's job is to be the first draft of history. So it's okay if I do a study that is not perfect, but it's still better than a one-off. And it shows that this is a systematic problem. And so I really believe journalism needs to focus more on trying to build those better evidence, more systematic analysis. And so maybe take people off of the beat of like writing something that was already going to be published, right? Do we need to cover Google I/O's announcements? I don't know. They're going to
We may not need 2,000 journalists covering it.
Right. We may not. How about if we put half of them in another room just testing AI, you know? And so I feel like there's just an allocation of resources that's not quite right.
What explains that allocation? Like, why don't journalism companies do that?
I think a lot of it's driven by the business model. So
still,
the fact is that advertising revenue is still a big piece of it. And advertising revenue is about how many clicks do you get on your article. And so how many clicks do you get on your article is about how sexy and how fast. And so honestly, if you can go to Google I/O and be the first one to write, so there's a huge amount of this race to be first because you get the most clicks. And then there's like a steady decrease in clicks as time goes by. So there's a lot of that timingness. And then also I think there's just a sort of weird sense that you actually have to cover these things. Like if they've called a press conference, you need to go. And this is partly because of access journalism, this idea like, oh, I'll get time with the executives and they're going to tell me something meaningful. Tell me a time that any of these executives ever said anything meaningful.
In a prearranged press junket.
It reminds me of the ones that the movie stars do when they're promoting their next movie. They sit down with a journalist for 10 minutes in a hotel room and they say nothing. It's totally anodyne. The entire write-up is about what outfit they were wearing and what they ordered from room service. And I don't know why journalists do that either, right? I mean, this is just, you're doing free marketing for these people.
Yeah. Do you think journalism is capable of opening up the box of these companies and the scale of them and the power of them and the legal protection they have?
I mean, we, more than anyone, we see ourselves as watchdogs of power, right? And these companies are more powerful than any government than any institution we've ever seen in the history of the world. They literally control speech around the globe. No one has ever had the power that Mark Zuckerberg has. If he decides that in some country he wants some candidate to win, he just puts his thumb on the scale and it's done, right? Now, we don't know that he's done that, but he's certainly done things that have enabled bad things to happen, the Rohingya massacre in Burma. And so we have to be watchdogs on these companies because we've never seen this type of power.
You've seen journalism and decline to the state it's in now, despite some obviously great examples of journalism surviving and thriving. It's pretty steep decline over the last 20 years from
Absolutely.
what it was to what it is now. What do you see as the future of journalism, and how does it get out of this nosedive it seems to be in? It's hard to watch, right?
It's horrible. Yeah, it's horrible. I know so many amazing reporters who don't have jobs, who are leaving the field. It's heartbreaking. It's truly heartbreaking. I don't know what stops it. I think there's a lot of things that we can do. I'm not a believer in big, massive solutions. I actually think a lot of times change happens slowly and incrementally. So, for instance, let's say we made some rules about you can't steal everyone's content and make it in your AI model. It would make a difference.
Some basic foundational
right?
rules.
What if we had a federal privacy law that prevented all this data exploitation that is ruining companies' abilities to monetize their audiences, right? I think there's a lot of things that we could do that are really low-hanging fruit that would make a difference. Is not a total solution. I'll tell you that what I'm doing is I'm making a bid on trying to do most of my work on YouTube and TikTok. I think that the audiences have moved there. I think serious journalism has not taken those platforms seriously. And I think that there's a real opportunity to have a different relationship. I think people have lost trust in journalism for all sorts of unfortunately valid reasons. And so having that face and the credibility of a person speaking to you and explaining what they did and how they did it and why they did it and what the limitations are. That's my bid right now, is to try to rebuild trust with audiences.
By becoming a journalistic influencer.
Please don't say that.
What are the stakes of getting all this right? I feel like we're in this moment that is politically unstable and perilous, and journalism was once a counterbalance to all sorts of trends that seem to be reemerging.
The stakes are really high right now. Journalism is absolutely a prerequisite for democracy. You see this in India. I think they're a real leading indicator. It's still technically a democracy, but the prime minister there basically decimated the press and press freedoms in the past 5-6 years, and there's no place anyone can write about these things. And so it's one of these things where you can still call yourself a democracy, but is it a meaningful democracy if there's no real opposition?
Yeah, I feel like that's the moment we're in, both the rise of a new technological infrastructure and shifting politics in a real way. So, and you're at the center of it. So, thanks for talking us through it. And I wish you luck.
Thank you.
Coming out of this therapy session.
I feel like we're going to leave your audience feeling very depressed right now.
Well, leave them hopeful. What's the positive future for journalism?
I think there's a real opportunity that I'm chasing to educate the public about how hard we try to get things right. I don't think journalism has done a good job of marketing itself. We have really strong norms in our newsrooms about fact-checking and about making sure that we try to get comment from anyone that we quote or that we talk about in an article. And I don't think the public understands a lot of that. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do in this approach of doing things more transparently, either through video or through written ingredients labels, is to bring people into that process and show them. Because I guess I have a very naive belief that if they see it, they might
show your work.
Yes, that they might
look at all the effort I put into this.
That they might trust it more. I don't know, man. It's my best hope at the moment.
Well, good luck.
Thank
we'll be
you.
watching. Yeah.